The fog was thick, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and turned everything it touched into ghostly silhouettes. Abigail had lived near the misty coastline all her life, but she had never seen anything like this. She could barely see a few feet ahead, and the fog moved unnaturally, like it had a mind of its own. It swirled and rolled, creeping along the ground, swallowing the narrow path she walked, erasing the world behind her. And then she heard it, a footstep, one heavy thud in the damp earth. Then another, slow, deliberate. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart hammered, each beat echoing in her ears louder than the world around her. The footsteps came again, louder now, closer, though the path ahead was empty. "Who's there?" Abigail called, her voice trembling. Silence answered. The footsteps ceased. Her eyes scanned the wall of fog, searching for movement, but all she saw was swirling gray. A shiver crawled down her spine. Maybe it was just the wind, she told herself, or an animal, hidden in the mist. Still, her hand gripped the small flashlight in her pocket, even though she knew it would do little good in this thick fog. She took another step forward, her senses heightened, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. As she moved, her own footsteps were soft, barely audible on the damp, moss-covered trail. She walked a few paces more, her skin prickling with unease. Then came the sound again, another footstep. It wasn't hers. It was behind her, slow, deliberate, matching her pace. Her pulse quickened. She spun around, peering into the fog, but the path was as empty as before. She was alone, completely, utterly alone, and yet someone, or something, was following her. She took a shaky breath and hurried forward, her feet moving faster, the fear building in her chest like a rising tide. The footsteps behind her matched her speed, closer now, impossibly close. But no matter how quickly she moved, no matter how desperately she tried to escape, they never faltered. Something was there, something she couldn't see. The unseen being stalked her, its presence pressing against the very air around her. She began to run. Abigail burst through the door of her small coastal cottage, slamming it behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs shaking from the run. She collapsed against the door, clutching the cold doorknob with trembling hands, as if holding it shut would keep whatever it was outside. Silence reigned inside the house. She waited, straining her ears, listening for the footsteps, for anything, but all she could hear was her own heartbeat and the faint whistle of the wind outside. The fog pressed against the windows like pale fingers, distorting the view of the world outside. Shadows shifted in the mist, twisting and writhing, but they were just tricks of the light. Or at least, that's what Abigail told herself. She stumbled toward the window, peeking out cautiously, her breath fogging up the glass. Nothing moved, not even the branches of the old oak tree in the yard. The world was eerily still, as though time itself had frozen. Then, from deep within the fog, there was a low hum, a vibration so subtle it seemed to come from the earth itself, or maybe the air. It filled the house, making the floorboards creak and the windows rattle faintly in their frames. Abigail's skin crawled. The sound wasn't natural. It was something deeper, something ancient, as if the fog carried with it voices from another time. She backed away from the window, heart pounding. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger now, like unseen eyes bore into her from every corner of the room. But it was more than that. Whatever had followed her in the fog had found a way into her home. "Stop it," she whispered to herself. "You're imagining things." But the sense of dread only grew. She felt it, like a weight pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her eyes darted around the room, her mind racing, and then she heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they weren't outside. They were inside the house. The floor creaked softly beneath invisible feet. Abigail froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The footsteps echoed through the small cottage, slow and steady, coming from the hallway just beyond the kitchen. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart hammering in her chest. It couldn't be real. It had to be in her mind. She was scaring herself, letting her imagination run wild. But the sound was so clear, so distinct. Abigail grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candle holder from the dining table, and held it in front of her like a weapon. She edged toward the kitchen doorway, her heart thudding in her ears. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the sound itself. Abigail held her breath, waiting, listening. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the fog outside had seeped into the very walls of her home. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper, as if something lurked just beyond her vision. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the kitchen. The cupboard door had swung open violently, slamming against the wall. Abigail screamed, stumbling backward, her hand trembling as she held the candle holder out in front of her. She stared at the open cupboard, her heart pounding in her throat. There was no one there, nothing that could have caused it. But she could feel it now, the presence. It was here, inside her house. The fog, thick and oppressive, pressed against the windows, but something far worse was inside with her. The air inside the cottage grew colder, as though the warmth of the world was being slowly drained away. Abigail could see her breath now, the mist of it mingling with the fog outside. She moved cautiously toward the kitchen, her feet dragging across the wooden floor. Suddenly, from the depths of the fog came a whisper, a soft, insidious murmur that curled into her ears like a wisp of smoke. "Come closer." Abigail froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but she knew it wasn't her imagination. She wasn't alone anymore. Panic surged through her. She backed away, her eyes darting from corner to corner, desperately searching for the source of the whisper. But there was nothing but shadows and the creeping fog that pressed against the windows, clawing at the glass. And then, the voice came again, louder this time, clearer. "I see you." The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows stretching, bending, as if something was moving within them. Abigail's pulse raced. She stumbled toward the door, her hand fumbling with a lock, desperate to escape. But before she could open it, the fog outside the window began to swirl violently, and a figure, a shadowy, indistinct shape, formed within the mist. It was tall, too tall, its limbs elongated, its form grotesque and unnatural. Abigail gasped, her back pressing against the door, her hand shaking on the doorknob. She could feel the presence now, oppressive and suffocating, like something was closing in on her from all sides. And then, the figure moved. It was slow, deliberate, just like the footsteps she had heard earlier. The shadowed being, hidden in the fog, was coming closer. The figure in the fog was no longer just a suggestion of movement. It was there, unmistakable, emerging from the swirling grey like a nightmare brought to life. Its form was undefined, constantly shifting as though it were a part of the fog itself, yet somehow separate, more solid, more sinister. Abigail's throat clenched as a cold sweat broke out across her skin. Her body refused to move, every muscle frozen in sheer terror. She had to get out, had to escape before that thing, whatever it was, reached her. But no matter how hard she willed herself to open the door behind her, her hand wouldn't obey. The shadowed figure glided closer, its movements unervingly smooth, silent except for the relentless footsteps. There was no face, no eyes, but she could feel it watching her, assessing her. It stopped a few feet away, just outside the window, its shape undulating in the fog like a living shadow. Then came the whisper again, this time inside her mind, echoing from within her own thoughts. "I've been waiting for you." Her breath hitched. It wasn't just here for her. It had always been here, lurking, waiting for the right moment. And now, it was calling her. With every ounce of strength she had, Abigail yanked the door open, her body finally breaking free from the invisible chains that had held her in place. She bolted out into the night, into the thick, suffocating fog. The world outside was no better than inside. The fog was even thicker here, wrapping around her like cold, clammy hands, but she didn't care. She had to run. She sprinted down the narrow path, her footsteps frantic on the wet earth. But no matter how fast she ran, the footsteps followed, steady and unhurried. They were everywhere now, coming from all directions, echoing through the fog. It was as if the very ground beneath her was alive with unseen beings, their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The footsteps were getting closer, faster. The fog swirled around her, disorienting her, blurring the lines between the path and the wilderness beyond. "I see you." The voice echoed again in her mind, more insistent now, more menacing. "You can't run." Abigail's heart raced. She stumbled, nearly falling to her knees, but caught herself just in time. Her vision blurred, her mind clouded with panic. She had no idea where she was going. The fog had swallowed the world around her, reducing everything to a shapeless void. And then she heard it, a different sound, a low, guttural growl, followed by a sharp snap of branches. It came from somewhere ahead, cutting through the fog like a knife. Something was waiting for her up ahead, something far worse than the unseen being that followed her. Her instincts screamed at her to stop, but it was too late. A dark shape emerged from the fog, monstrous and hulking. Its eyes, two glowing pinpricks of light, pierced through the grey, locking onto her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. It wasn't human. It wasn't even of this world. Abigail skidded to a halt, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. She was trapped. Behind her, the footsteps of the unseen being were growing louder, closer, as if it was right on top of her. In front of her, the creature from the fog stood still, waiting, its glowing eyes watching her every move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the mist, as if it had never been there at all. But the footsteps, the relentless, invisible footsteps, remained. Abigail's body shook with fear. She backed away, her legs trembling, her mind spiraling into chaos. The fog pressed against her, thick and suffocating, closing in on her from all sides. And then, suddenly, the world shifted. The fog seemed to pull away, revealing a vast, empty space ahead, an endless expanse of grey nothingness. It was as though she had stepped out of reality itself, into some liminal space between worlds. In the distance, she could see it, the figure, the unseen being. It was no longer hidden by the fog. It stood tall, its form shadowy and undefined, but its presence was undeniable. It beckoned to her, its voice soft and inviting. "Come, it's time." Abigail's chest tightened. She couldn't fight it anymore. She had been running from something she couldn't escape, something that had been watching her, waiting for this moment all along. Tears stung her eyes as she realized the truth. The footsteps had never been leading her to safety. They had been leading her to this place, to this moment. The fog swirled around her, whispering her name, pulling her closer to the figure. She took one step forward, then another, her body moving of its own accord, her mind too numb with terror to resist. The unseen being reached out, its hand, if you could call it a hand, extended toward her. As its shadowed fingers touched her skin, a cold so deep it froze her very soul seeped into her, spreading through her veins like ice. "You're mine now," the voice whispered, and with that final word, the world around Abigail disappeared into the fog. The cottage stood silent, shrouded in mist, as it had for countless years. The fog clung to the coastline, thick and unmoving, wrapping the small home in its suffocating embrace. Inside, the air was still, the faint scent of salt and moss hanging in the atmosphere. And then, from somewhere deep within the fog, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unseen. No one was there to hear them, no one to see the shadowy figure that moved just beyond the reach of reality. But the footsteps continued, echoing through the fog, as they always had, waiting for the next soul to wander too close, waiting for the fog to claim them.